Abigail Whitmore did not scream when she watched Nathaniel Mercer place a wedding ring on her younger sister's hand. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach where 2 lives were already growing, lifted her chin, and walked out of that church before the final blessing fell. Nobody stopped her. Nobody even looked. And that silence, that terrible ordinary silence, told her everything she needed to know about who she was to these people. If you've ever been invisible to someone who should have loved you, stay with me. Subscribe. Follow this story to the very end and drop your city in the comments. I want to see how far this reaches. The summer of 1815 sat heavy over Hargrove County, Virginia, the way summer always did, thick with heat, thick with manners, thick with the particular cruelty of people who smiled while they buried you. St. Andrew's Episcopal Church had been dressed for celebration. Pew ribbons in cream and gold. Candles burning along every windowsill. The Whitmore family occupied the first 3 rows on the left side, straight-backed and still as portraits. Every one of them wearing the expression of people who had already decided how the day would end and were merely waiting for the rest of the world to catch up. Abigail stood at the rear of the nave. She had not been invited. She had come anyway. She was 24 years old, wearing a dove-gray dress that was 2 seasons behind the fashion, her dark hair pinned without decoration. Her hands folded in front of her at the precise angle her mother had drilled into her since girlhood. Still, composed, unreadable. Every inch the eldest Whitmore daughter trained since birth to take up as little space as possible and be grateful for the privilege. Her sister Caroline stood at the altar in white silk and French lace, luminous and trembling with the particular beauty of a girl who had been told her whole life that this moment was the only one that mattered. Nathaniel Mercer stood beside her. He was 31, broad across the shoulders, with the careful posture of a man who had spent his adult life walking into rooms where other men already had opinions about him. His dark coat was pressed. His jaw was set. His eyes, Abigail had memorized his eyes over 18 months of careful, quiet, private correspondence, were fixed on the minister with an expression she could not read from this distance. She pressed her palm flat against her stomach. 8 weeks. She had known for 8 weeks. She had told no one. The minister's voice rose and fell in the old cadences, and Abigail listened to the words the way you listen to thunder when you already know the lightning has already struck. To have and to hold. From this day forward, her mother Margaret Whitmore sat in the front row with her spine perfectly straight and her gloved hands folded in her lap. She did not turn around. She did not need to. Margaret Whitmore had spent 40 years perfecting the art of winning without appearing to fight. And this morning, this church, this wedding, this arrangement she had built from careful letters and careful silence was her masterwork. Abigail had figured it out 3 days ago. She had been in the Whitmore study looking for the deed her father had left her in his will. The small parcel of land near the eastern creek that was supposed to be hers alone, the one thing nobody could take. She had found instead a bundle of letters tied with blue ribbon in the bottom drawer of her mother's writing desk. Nathaniel's handwriting. She had known it immediately strong and slanted the particular way he looped the letter A, the way he always wrote with great sincerity before his signature. The letters were his original courtship correspondence. Everyone addressed to Abigail. Everyone intercepted. Tucked behind them in her mother's own neat hand was the reply that had been sent in Abigail's name. She had read it once, standing in the study with her father's letter opener still in her hand. And she had understood with the clarity that comes just before grief arrives exactly what had been done to her. Mr. Mercer, I thank you for your kind attention, but I must inform you that my affections lie elsewhere, and I cannot in good conscience encourage your pursuit. I wish you every happiness. Miss Abigail Whitmore. She had never written those words. She had never thought them. She had spent 18 months reading every letter Nathaniel sent through a circuit of 3 trusted acquaintances, writing back carefully. Falling in love with the quietness of a man who asked her opinions about books and argued with her about river navigation routes, and once wrote an entire page about why he believed women ought to be permitted to manage their own estates. Her mother had taken all of it, had answered for her, had then turned smoothly to Caroline, 16, and eager to please, and begun building an entirely different arrangement. Abigail had stood in the study with the letters in her hands for a long time. Then she had put them back exactly as she found them. Retied. The blue ribbon closed. The drawer, walked to her own room, sat on the edge of her bed, and done her arithmetic. She was 8 weeks along. Nathaniel would marry Caroline in 3 days. Her mother controlled the household accounts, the social connections, the family name, and the legal standing of every unmarried woman under the Whitmore roof. Abigail had $43 in a tin behind her wardrobe, a small gold locket her father had given her the deed to a creekside parcel that her mother had almost certainly already found a way to contest, and 2 lives growing inside her that nobody in this county could ever be allowed to know about. She had started planning that same night. To have and to hold, the minister said, for better or for worse. Caroline said, I do, in a voice like a bell. Nathaniel said, I do, in a voice Abigail could not quite hear from the back of the nave. Margaret Whitmore's shoulders relaxed by precisely 1 degree. Abigail turned and walked out of the church. The heat hit her in the face like an open hand. The churchyard road was already softening in the summer sun, and her boots sank slightly with each step, but she kept walking past the carriages and the tethered horses and the cluster of men smoking pipes by the road gate, none of whom looked up. She had a coach to catch. She had arranged it through the headmaster of the Hargrove County Schoolhouse, a thin, honest man named Mr. Pierce, who had employed her as an assistant teacher for 2 years, and who was the only person in the county she trusted with a partial truth. She had told him she needed to visit a sick relation in Pennsylvania and would require a letter of character for teaching work in the North. He had given it without asking too many questions, which was the most generous thing any man had done for her in recent memory. The coach north left from the Hargrove Inn at 2 o'clock. It was noon. She walked. Behind her, through the thick stone walls of St. Andrew's, she heard the congregation begin to sing, and the sound followed her down the road like something she was supposed to feel worse about leaving behind. She did not look back. The Hargrove Inn smelled of wood smoke and horse, and the particular sharpness of summer beer spilled on old floors. Abigail sat in the corner with her single traveling bag at her feet, and her hands folded on the table in front of her, and she watched the door, and she breathed, and she did not let herself think past the next necessary thing. Next necessary thing board the coach. Next necessary thing after that ride north until Virginia was behind her. Everything else could wait. A man at the bar was talking loudly about the Mercer wedding. Finest match in the county, he said to no one in particular. That Whitmore girl is a beauty, I'll say that. Mercer's done well for himself. Abigail looked at her hands. The innkeeper's wife, a stout woman with a kind face and quick eyes, set a cup of tea on the table without being asked. You waiting on the northbound, honey? Yes, ma'am. Leaves at 2 sharp. Driver don't wait. I'll be ready. The woman looked at her for a moment with the particular attention of someone who notices things but knows better than to say them. You need anything else, you just holler. Thank you, Abigail said. I'm fine. She was not fine. She was so far from fine that fine felt like a foreign country she'd read about once in a geography book. But she was upright. She was breathing. She had $43 and a letter of character and 2 lives depending on her ability to stay exactly as calm as she appeared, and that would have to be sufficient. The coach came at 2:05. She climbed in and did not look back at Hargrove County as it disappeared behind her. But she rode under the name Mrs. Anna Reed, widow, traveling to visit family in Pennsylvania. She had chosen the name carefully. Reed was plain and forgettable. Anna was common enough to answer to without hesitation. Widow explained the absence of a husband without inviting sympathy or scrutiny. She had practiced saying it in her room the night before, looking at herself in the small mirror above her washstand. Mrs. Reed, Anna Reed. My husband passed last winter. God rest him. She'd said it until it stopped feeling like a lie and started feeling like armor. The other passengers in the coach were a merchant traveling to Philadelphia, a young mother with an infant who slept the whole way, and an elderly pastor who spent the journey reading his Bible and occasionally glancing at Abigail with the benevolent curiosity of a man who has seen too much of the world to be fooled by composed faces. He said nothing until they stopped to change horses outside of Fredericksburg, when he climbed down and stood beside her in the dust and said quietly, "Are you all right, child?" "Yes, sir," she said. "Thank you for asking." He looked at her the way her father used to look at her, without the need to fix anything, just the acknowledgement that he saw her. "The Lord keeps better records than men do," he said. "Whatever's been written down wrong, he knows the truth of it." She could not speak for a moment. "Yes, sir," she finally managed. "I believe that." He nodded and climbed back into the coach. She stood in the dust for 3 more breaths, her hand pressed flat against her stomach, the road behind her already longer than the road ahead. And then she followed him. She found the town of Millhaven by accident and by necessity. The coach had stopped in a small settlement near the Pennsylvania border for an overnight rest, and she had asked the innkeeper whether there was schoolteacher work nearby. He had sent her to speak with a farmer named Calhoun, who was on the town council, who had mentioned that Millhaven, 8 miles east, half farming, half river trade, had lost its schoolteacher to marriage the previous spring and hadn't found a replacement. She rode to Millhaven the next morning in the back of Calhoun's grain wagon, her bag on her lap, and her letter of character in her pocket. The town was plain and honest in the way that hard places often were. No courthouse, 1 church, 1 general store, a mill, a tavern, and about 40 families spread along the river road. The schoolhouse was a single room with a wood stove and 22 students between the ages of 6 and 15, some of whom had never held a pencil. The man who ran the school board was named Aldous Hatch, a former school teacher himself, gone stiff in one leg from a mill accident, with small, sharp eyes that moved fast and a mouth that moved slow. He looked at her letter. He looked at her. He said, "You're young." "I am 24, sir. I have been teaching children to read and figure for 2 years in Hargrove County, Virginia. I can provide references." "You're a widow," it says. "Yes, sir." He looked at her stomach. She held very still. "My wife passed 4 years back," he said not unkindly. "Millhaven's a decent town. People mind their own mostly. Pays not what you'd get in a city. I am not looking for city wages. I am looking for a place where I can work and be left in peace to do it." He was quiet for a long moment. "School starts Monday at 7, he said. "You'll stay in the schoolhouse room until you find your own arrangement. There's a cot and a stove." "That will suit me fine," she said. "One question," Aldous said. "The child you expecting?" She had known this was coming. She had prepared for it. "Yes, sir. Due in the winter." He looked at the letter again. "You teach well." "I do." "Then we'll figure the rest as it comes," he said, and held out his hand. She shook it. She taught. She taught reading from the King James Bible and whatever almanacs the families could spare. She taught arithmetic by counting seed costs against harvest prices, because these children understood money in a way they did not yet understand numbers, and she had learned from her father that the fastest path to a concept was always through something a person already cared about. She taught them to read a contract, to count their wages, to understand that a man who couldn't be cheated was a man worth being. The town was suspicious of her for the first month. She was Southern, she was young. She was a widow who had apparently arrived from nowhere with no family and no explanations, and the women of Millhaven were not cruel exactly, but they were watchful in the way that close communities always were. What changed was the Garber boy. Thomas Garber was 11, the eldest son of a struggling river farmer, and he had been told his whole life by his father that school was for people who could afford to waste time on books. He had arrived in Abigail's classroom in September on the condition that he could leave if she couldn't prove it was worth his while within 1 week. She had handed him a freight ledger from the general store, borrowed from old Mr. Pratt, who was owed a significant sum by a merchant downriver, and said, "Tell me if Pratt's been cheated." Thomas had looked at the columns of numbers for 20 minutes, laboring over the figures, and then he had looked up and said, "He's been cheated. That ain't right. That number there should be." "Show me," Abigail said. He showed her. "Correct," she said. "Now, do you want to know how to make sure that never happens to your father?" Thomas Garber came back every day after that. His father started attending the evening reading sessions she opened to adults on Thursdays. By November, the Millhaven women had begun leaving firewood at her door. By December, she had learned the names of every family in a 6-mile radius, the weight of every old grudge the town carried, and the precise location of every person she could trust, with a partial truth if it ever came to that. She gave birth in January during a snowstorm attended by a widowed midwife named Hester Crane, who had delivered half the children in the county and who took one look at Abigail's composed face and said, "Honey, you are allowed to make noise. Ain't nobody here but me." Abigail made noise, and then there were two. Samuel came first, loud and furious, grabbing at the air as though he had somewhere to be. Clara came second, quiet and wide-eyed, blinking at the world, with an expression of serene assessment that made Hester laugh out loud. "Lord," Hester said, "this one's going to know everything before anybody tells her." Abigail lay back against the pillow and looked at them, one in each arm, both of them impossibly real, impossibly hers, and felt something move through her chest that was not quite grief and not quite joy, but was large enough to contain both. "Hello," she said quietly. "I'm your mother. We are going to be all right." Samuel grabbed her finger. Clara watched her face. "I promise," Abigail said. "We are going to be all right." 5 years passed. They passed the way years pass when you are working too hard to watch them go. Samuel grew bold and restless, always in the middle of something, always asking the next question before the last one was answered, already showing the particular stubbornness of a child who has been raised to believe his voice has value. Clara grew quiet and precise, collecting information the way other children collected stones, filing it away behind those steady eyes. And when she did speak, she spoke in complete sentences that sometimes made the adults around her go very still. Abigail taught by day and sewed by candlelight at night, taking in mending and alterations from the better-off families to supplement her teacher's wage. She had friends in Millhaven now. Hester, who came by every Sunday. Aldous Hatch, whose sharp eyes had gentled over the years into something approaching fatherly. Young Thomas Garber, now 16 and already teaching the younger students himself when Abigail was occupied. She had made a life. It was not the life she had imagined at 22, reading Nathaniel Mercer's letters by firelight and believing foolishly that honesty between two people was enough to protect them from the world. It was harder than that life would have been, and smaller in some ways, and larger in others, and it was entirely hers. She had not permitted herself to miss him. Or she had permitted it privately at night, with the disciplined brevity of someone who understood that grief left unmanaged became a weight that would drag her under. She had loved him. She believed he had loved her. She believed the letters she had read in her mother's drawer. She had chosen for 5 years to let that belief exist quietly in a sealed room inside her chest, neither examined nor discarded. Then, on a Tuesday morning in June of 1820, a rider came up the Millhaven Road carrying a message. He stopped at the schoolhouse. He tied his horse at the post. He walked to the door, knocked twice, and when Abigail opened it, he looked at her with the expression of a man completing a task he does not fully understand, and said, "Ma'am, I've been sent by Mr. Nathaniel Mercer of Mercer Hall, Hargrove County, Virginia. He asked me to deliver this." He held out an envelope. On the front, in handwriting, she would have known in the dark, were 2 words: Abigail Whitmore. She stood in the doorway of the Millhaven schoolhouse for a long moment, 29 years old, 5 years gone. 2 children asleep on their cots in the back room during the noon rest, the summer heat pressing down on the road, the rider watching her with patient, careful eyes. She took the envelope. She did not open it in front of him. "Tell me," she said, is Mr. Mercer well?" The rider paused. "He's been looking for you for 2 years, ma'am. I'd say he's more determined than well." She looked at the envelope. She looked at the road south where Virginia lay at the end of a long, hot summer's ride full of everything she had left behind and everything she had not yet finished. "I see," she said. "He's coming himself, ma'am. 2 days behind me if the roads hold." She pressed her hand flat against her sternum. The old gesture, the one that had started 5 years ago in the back of a church when 2 lives were barely real yet, and breathed. Samuel appeared at her elbow. 5 years old, sharp-eyed, his dark hair falling across his forehead, exactly the way his father's did in the portrait she kept in the bottom of her traveling bag. He looked at the rider with the frank assessment of a child who has grown up around adults who mean what they say. "Mama," Samuel said. "Who's that man?" "A messenger," Abigail said. "What's the message?" She looked down at him. She looked at the envelope in her hand. She looked at the road. "I don't know yet," she said. "But we're going to find out." The envelope sat on the schoolhouse table for 20 minutes before Abigail opened it. She had sent the rider to the tavern for a meal and water for his horse. She had settled Samuel and Clara back onto their cots and told them the noon rest was not finished. She had stood at the table with her hands flat on either side of the envelope, looked at her own name in Nathaniel Mercer's handwriting, and breathed until her chest stopped feeling like it was being pressed from the inside. Then she broke the seal. The letter was 3 pages front and back, written in the dense, careful hand of a man who had clearly drafted it more than once and still was not satisfied with what he'd managed to say. She read the first line. "Abigail, I do not know if you are alive. I do not know if you will ever read this. I am writing it because I have run out of ways to live with not knowing." She sat down. She read the rest. Standing would have been impossible. He had not known she was pregnant. That came through on the second page, raw and unguarded, in a way that Nathaniel Mercer's letters had never been. Before, he had always been careful, always measured, the kind of man who chose his words like a carpenter, chose wood for grain and weight, and how they'd hold over time. This was not that. This was a man writing in the dark. "Caroline told me 6 months before she passed that your mother had come to her the week before our wedding with a letter. She believed it was from you. I had no reason to doubt I had received a letter in your hand declining my courtship, and I believed you had chosen another. I married your sister, believing you had made your choice. I need you to know that I was deceived as thoroughly as you were. I need you to know that I have spent 5 years trying to find you. I need you to know that whatever you decide when this letter reaches you, whatever you have built, wherever you are, I am not coming to take anything from you. I am coming because I could not live with myself if I did not try." She set the letter down. She pressed both hands over her face and sat there in the empty schoolhouse, the summer heat coming through the single south-facing window, the sound of Samuel murmuring something to Clara in the back room, and she let herself feel it, all of it. The 5 years of it, the specific, terrible loneliness of loving a person you've decided you cannot think about. She let it move through her like a tide, and then she let it go back out. She had 2 days. She picked the letter back up and read the last paragraph. "I have a writer ahead of me who will find you before I arrive. Please do not disappear again. I am asking you, Abigail. Please." She folded the letter. She put it in the tin beneath her floorboard, where she kept the $43 she'd arrived with. She'd never spent them. Some stubborn part of her had refused, and her father's locket and the original bundle of letters from her mother's drawer, which she had gone back for the night before she left Virginia, and which she had kept every day since like a loaded weapon. She prayed she'd never have to fire. Then she went to the back room and looked at her children. Samuel had fallen asleep mid-murmur, one arm thrown over his head. Clara was lying on her back, eyes open, staring at the ceiling, with the considering expression she wore when she was working something out. "Mama," Clara said quietly, "is something happening?" "Yes," Abigail said. "Bad something, or different something." Abigail thought about that. "Different," she said. "I don't know what kind yet." Clara nodded as though this was a perfectly reasonable answer. "I'll watch Samuel," she said, with the gravity of a 5-year-old who has already decided that watching Samuel is a full-time occupation. "Thank you, sweetheart." Abigail touched her daughter's hair. "Rest a little while longer." She walked back out into the schoolhouse, sat down at her teaching desk, took out a clean sheet of paper, and began to write the reply she had been composing in her head, in one form or another, for 5 years. The next 2 days were the longest of her life since the coach ride out of Virginia. She told Hester Crane that evening. She had to tell someone, and Hester was the person in Millhaven who had seen her at the most reduced she had ever been, split apart by labor in a January snowstorm, barely 24 alone, and had not flinched. Hester was not a woman who flinched. Hester listened to the whole thing over the kitchen table, with a cup of tea going cold in front of her. When Abigail finished, Hester was quiet for a moment, then said, "The children's father." "Yes. Coming here. In 2 days. And you, what do you want from this?" "I don't know." Hester looked at her with those steady, weathered eyes. "That ain't true." Abigail looked at this table. "I want the truth to matter," she said. "I want what my mother did to mean something, to cost something. I want—" She stopped. "Say it," Hester said. "I want him to see them," Abigail said, and her voice cracked on the last word for the first time in 5 years. "I want him to see Samuel and Clara, and I want him to know that we were real. That what was between us was real. That it wasn't nothing." Hester reached across the table and put her hand over Abigail's. "It wasn't nothing," she said. "Any fool could see those children and know it wasn't nothing. Samuel's got his jaw." A sound came out of Abigail that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one. She pressed her free hand over her mouth and held it there for a moment, and Hester held her hand, and the summer night came down around Millhaven soft and warm, and full of crickets. "You want me there when he comes?" Hester asked. "No," Abigail said. "This one I have to do alone." He arrived on a Thursday morning at 8:30, riding a gray horse up the Millhaven road, dusty from 2 days of travel, his dark coat creased at the shoulders. His face older than she remembered, and carrying something she recognized because she had been carrying the same thing for 5 years. The particular weight of a person who has been looking for something they were afraid they'd never find. She was standing at the schoolhouse doorway when he came up the road. She had been standing there for 20 minutes. She had sent the children to Hester's. He saw her when he was still 50 yards out. He pulled the horse to a stop. They looked at each other across that 50 yards of summer road, her in her plain gray teaching dress. Him on his gray horse, the distance between them full of everything that had happened and everything that had been done to both of them, and neither of them moved for a long suspended moment. Then he dismounted. He tied the horse at the post. He walked toward her, and she watched him come, and she kept her hands at her sides and her chin level, and she did not cry, and she did not speak first, and when he stopped 6 feet in front of her and looked at her face with an expression she had no word for, she said, "You look tired, Mr. Mercer." His jaw worked. "I've been riding 2 days, Miss Whitmore." "Mrs. Reed," she said. Habit, 5 years of habit. Something moved across his face. "You changed your name." "I had to. I know." His voice was rougher than she remembered. "I know, Abigail. I know why." He stopped. He pressed his hand briefly over his eyes, a gesture so human and unguarded that it cost her something to watch it. "I read everything. Caroline told me everything she knew before she died. And there are things your mother said to her, things she did. I have been trying to understand the shape of it for 2 years, and I still—" He stopped again. "Come inside," she said. "I'll make coffee." He followed her in. He sat at the schoolhouse table, the same table where she had read his letter 2 days ago, and she made coffee on the small iron stove, and she kept her back to him while the water heated because she needed 60 more seconds before she could look at him straight again. "Where are they?" he asked. She went still. "I know there are children," he said quietly. "My rider, he saw a boy at the door. Dark hair, about 5 years. A pause. "I did the arithmetic, Abigail." She turned around. He was looking at her with an expression that was not accusation, and not demand, and not any of the things she had rehearsed against. It was something closer to awe, or grief, or both sitting in the same place. "2," she said. "Samuel and Clara, they're 5. He closed his eyes. She watched him absorb it. Watched the moment it became real, not numbers on a page, not the arithmetic, but real children, 5 years old with names, and she watched him hold himself very still, the way she had learned to hold herself still when something was too large to feel all at once. "Where are they now?" he asked. His voice was careful, very careful. "With a friend. I sent them away this morning. I needed to speak with you first, before they knew who you were." He opened his eyes. "And who am I?" he asked. "To them? No one," she said. "Yet." The word landed between them, and she did not take it back. "That's fair," he said. She brought him the coffee and sat across the table, and they looked at each other, and for a moment, the whole 5 years were in the room with them, the church, The letters, the coach, the snow, the two children born in January who didn't know their father's name. "Nathaniel," she said. First time she'd used it. His breath caught. "Tell me exactly what Caroline told you." He told her. It took a long time. He spoke carefully, laying it out the way a man lays out evidence when he wants to be believed. Not dramatically, not with appeals to her sympathy, but piece by piece, in order, asking her to stop him if anything contradicted what she knew. She did not stop him often. Caroline, he said, had been told by Margaret Whitmore 1 week before the wedding that Abigail had already made an arrangement with a young man in Richmond and would be leaving Virginia within the month. Caroline had been 19. She had believed her mother. She had loved Nathaniel in the way of a girl who had been told since childhood that marrying well was the same as being well, and she had married him without fully understanding that she was built on a foundation of lies. "She was kind to me," Nathaniel said of Caroline, and there was grief in it that Abigail did not begrudge him. "She was gentle. She was not happy, I think. Not the way she deserved to be. And I don't know how much of that was knowing something was wrong and not being able to say what." He paused. "She asked me 2 months before she died whether I had ever been in love before her. I told her the truth. She cried for a long time, and then she told me to find you." Abigail was quiet for a moment. "She said that her exact words were—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "Find Abigail, tell her I'm sorry, and give her back whatever my mother took." A pause. "I think she knew more than she ever said out loud." Abigail looked at the table. She had spent 5 years making herself not hate Caroline. It had been one of the disciplines she'd imposed on herself alongside not spending the $43 and not letting grief become a weight that dragged her under. Caroline had been 19 and raised in the same house by the same woman. The difference between them was not virtue. It was just luck. Abigail had been older, had known her own mind, slightly more, had been just suspicious enough of her mother to check the drawer. "The letters," Abigail said. "My mother's forged reply to your courtship. I have the originals. The letters you sent me, and the reply she wrote in my name." He went very still. "You have them." "I took them the night before I left Virginia. I've kept them for 5 years." The expression on his face, she would remember it for the rest of her life. It was the expression of a man who has been fighting in the dark and suddenly sees where the door is. "Abigail," he said, and his voice was different now, lower and more urgent. "Your mother has filed a petition." She looked up sharply. "I received it 10 days before I sent my rider north. She's claiming—" He paused, choosing his words. "She's claiming you abandoned your children to my wife's household. That the twins are Mercer children who belong under Mercer guardianship, which she intends to manage as their nearest maternal relation, given that you're—" He stopped. "Given that I'm what?" she said very quietly. "Given that you're, in her words, a morally compromised woman, living outside the bounds of respectable society." The silence in the schoolhouse was absolute. Abigail set her coffee cup down. She set it down with such precise, deliberate care that it made no sound at all. "She doesn't know where I am," she said. "She doesn't. But she filed the petition in Hargrove County Court, which means she has 30 days to—" "Me. How long ago was 30 days? 12 days ago." She stood up. "I need you to understand something," she said, and her voice was steady in the way that it was only steady when she was most afraid, when everything in her was marshaled and moving in the same direction. "Those children have never been in Margaret Whitmore's care. They have never been in your household. They have been in my care in this town, taught by me, and raised by me, and loved by me for 5 years. She does not get to walk into a courtroom and erase that." "No," Nathaniel said, and he was standing now too on the other side of the table, and his voice matched hers, not arguing with her, not calming her, but matching her the way a person stands shoulder to shoulder and not in the way. "She doesn't, but she's going to try Abigail. You know your mother." She knew her mother. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum. The old gesture. The one that had started in a church 5 years ago. "The letters I have," she said. "Your original courtship letters, her forged reply. That is proof of the deception." "Yes." "And Caroline's testimony, is there a written record? Did she—" She left a letter, with her lawyer in Richmond, to be opened in the event of a legal challenge. He paused. She planned ahead. Abigail looked at him. She planned ahead. Yes, something shifted in her chest. Grief and gratitude, and the complicated tenderness of forgiving someone who can no longer ask for it. Then we go back, she said. He looked at her carefully. You're sure? I'm sure, she said. But Nathaniel, we go back on my terms. I am not going back as a disgraced daughter crawling home. I am going back as the woman who has the evidence, the witnesses, and 5 years of receipts. She looked at him steadily. Can you live with that? He looked at her for a long moment. This woman who had been 24 and alone in a church doorway, and had chosen in that moment not to break but to plan. And he said, I drove 2 days through summer roads to find you. I can live with anything you decide. Good, she said. She moved toward the door. I'm going to get my children, she said. They should meet you. Before we go anywhere or decide anything else, they should meet you. She stopped in the doorway, turned back. Samuel is bold, she said. He will ask you direct questions, and he will not be satisfied with indirect answers. Clara will not say much. She will watch you, and she will know before I do whether you mean what you say. He stood at the table with his hat in his hands, and his expression open and honest and afraid, in the way that people are afraid when something they have wanted for a long time is suddenly within reach, and they understand for the first time how much it would hurt to lose it. I'll do my best, he said. That's all I'm asking, she said. For now. She stepped out into the summer morning. Hester's house was 4 minutes up the road. Abigail walked it at a steady pace, her hands at her sides. The sun already warm on her face, thinking about courtrooms and letters, and the way her mother's handwriting had looked in the lamplight of that study 5 years ago, neat and deliberate and absolutely certain of itself. Margaret Whitmore had had 5 years to build her case. Abigail had had 5 years to build hers. She turned in at Hester's gate. Through the kitchen window, she could see Samuel standing on a chair explaining something at high volume to Hester, who was listening with the patience of a woman who had raised 6 children and was therefore unshockable. Clara was sitting on the kitchen table. She was not supposed to sit on the table, but with Hester she always did, watching her brother with the serene, analytical expression of a scientist observing a phenomenon. Abigail pushed open the door. Both children turned. Mama, Clara said immediately. The man is still here. He is, Abigail said. Who is he? Abigail crouched down to their level. Samuel climbed off the chair and came to stand in front of her, chin up, already ready to be told something important, already preparing his questions. Clara slid off the table and moved to her mother's side and put her small hand in Abigail's hand. His name is Nathaniel Mercer, Abigail said. He knew me a long time ago, before you were born. Did you like him? Samuel demanded. Yes, she said, very much. Do you like him now? She looked at her son. I don't know yet, she said honestly, but I think so. Then we should go meet him, Samuel said, as though this resolved the matter entirely, and turned toward the door. Clara had not moved. She was looking at Abigail's face with those steady eyes. Mama, Clara said very quietly, is he the reason we don't have a father? The question was so precise, and so gentle, and so devastatingly accurate, that Abigail had to take one slow breath before she could answer it. It's more complicated than that, she said. But yes, he's connected to that answer. Clara considered this. Then she nodded with the gravity of a child who has decided to reserve judgment, but not withhold attention. All right, Clara said, and she walked out the door after her brother. Samuel reached the schoolhouse door first. He always reached things first. It was simply the way he was built. Feet moving before the decision was fully made, the world a series of thresholds he needed to cross before anyone told him he couldn't. He pushed the door open with both hands and walked straight in, and stopped in front of Nathaniel Mercer, and looked up at him with the frank, unblinking assessment of a 5-year-old who had been raised to trust his own judgment. Nathaniel looked down. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Samuel said, "You're tall." Nathaniel said, "You're not yet." Samuel considered this with great seriousness. Mama says I'll be tall when I'm older. Your mama, Nathaniel said carefully, is usually right about things. Something shifted in Samuel's face, a small recalibration, the kind children make when an adult says the right thing without knowing they were being tested. He stepped back and allowed Clara to come forward, which was the closest Samuel ever came to deference. Clara stopped 2 feet in front of Nathaniel and looked at him. She did not speak. She simply looked with those still, measuring eyes that Hester always said belonged on someone 3 times her age. And Nathaniel looked back, and he had the very particular, slightly unnerving sense, that he was being assessed by someone who would reach an accurate conclusion, regardless of anything he said or did to influence it. "Your name is Nathaniel," Clara said finally. "Yes, Mama used your whole name," Clara said. "She doesn't do that unless it's important." Nathaniel glanced at Abigail over Clara's head. Abigail said nothing. "It is important," he said. Clara nodded once, as though a question had been answered that she hadn't asked out loud, and stepped back beside her brother. Abigail watched all of this from the doorway and felt something loosen in her chest that had been knotted for 5 years. Not all the way, not yet, but enough to breathe around. She did not let it show. There was too much still ahead to let it show yet. They had 1 day in Millhaven before they needed to leave, and Abigail used every hour of it. She sat with Nathaniel at the schoolhouse table that afternoon and spread out everything she had. The original bundle of letters from her mother's drawer. Nathaniel's courtship correspondence in one pile. Her mother's forged reply in another. And the land deed. Her father had left her. That Margaret had never managed to legally contest, because Abigail had taken the original copy and her mother had only the duplicate. Nathaniel picked up the forged letter and read it. His jaw tightened. She watched it happen, the slow recognition, the way a person looks when they are reading the exact words that cost them 5 years of their life. "Her handwriting is close to yours," he said. "She taught me to write," Abigail said. "She modeled mine on hers. She knew it would be close enough." He set the letter down very carefully. "She planned this for a long time." "Yes. Not impulsive, not a mistake." "No." He looked at Abigail. "She looked me in the face at the wedding," he said. "She shook my hand. She said she hoped I would be happy." He paused. "I thanked her." The flatness in his voice was worse than anger would have been. "Nathaniel." She waited until he looked at her. "What she did to you and what she did to me are different wounds, but they came from the same blade. I need you to remember that when we're in front of that magistrate, because she is going to try to make you feel like a fool for being deceived, and you are not a fool. You were lied to by someone you had no reason to distrust." He was quiet. "You were lied to," she said again more quietly. "Same as me. I should have looked harder," he said. "I should have questioned. You received a letter in what you believed was my hand saying I had chosen another. What was there to question?" She held his gaze. "I am not angry at you, Nathaniel. I was, for about the first 6 months. And then I ran out of the energy for it because I had 2 infants and a classroom of 22 children who needed me present." A pause. "The anger I kept for the right person." He looked at the forged letter on the table. "We'll need a lawyer," he said. "I know one," Abigail said, "in Hargrove County. My father used him before he passed. He knows the family. He'll understand the situation." "Will he take a case against Margaret Whitmore?" "He'll take a case where the evidence is this clear," she said. "He's an honest man. Honest men tend to enjoy cases where honesty wins." Nathaniel almost smiled. It was a tired smile, but it was real. "You've thought all of this through." "I've had 2 days," she said, "and 5 years of practice thinking about things I couldn't yet act on." He looked at her across the table. This woman who had walked out of a church with $43 and built an entire life in the space her mother thought she'd left empty, and said, "I owe you an apology that I don't have adequate words for." "You don't owe me an apology," she said. "You weren't the one who lied. I owe you one anyway." She looked at him for a moment. "Then give it when this is over," she said. "When we're on the other side of a courtroom and my mother has nothing left to threaten us with." Give it to me then, and I'll receive it properly." He nodded. All right, she said. "Now help me figure out how to get 2 5-year-olds to Virginia in summer heat without Samuel asking questions the entire way." "Is that difficult?" Nathaniel asked. "Samuel," she said, "asked me last week why the sky was blue. And when I explained it, he asked why light behaves that way. And when I explained that, he asked who decided on the rules and whether the rules could be different somewhere else." She paused. It was a long afternoon. This time Nathaniel did smile, and it reached his eyes, and she looked away before she could feel too much about it. They left Millhaven on Friday morning just after dawn. Hester came to see them off. She hugged Samuel first. He submitted to it with the resigned tolerance of a boy who understood that hugs from Hester were non-negotiable. And then Clara, who hugged back with her whole small self, which made Hester press her lips together and look at the middle distance for a moment. Then Hester looked at Abigail, and the look said everything they didn't have time to say. "You come back to us," Hester said. "I will," Abigail said. "Come back safe. Come back with the truth out in the light where it belongs." Hester took Abigail's face in both hands, the way she had done in the worst hour of that January snowstorm, when Abigail had been afraid and exhausted, and more alone than she had ever been, and said, "You are the finest woman I have ever known, Anna Reed, and I am glad to know your real name." Abigail's throat closed. "Abigail," she said. "Abigail Whitmore." "I know," Hester said. "I always knew it wasn't Reed." She stepped back. "Go on, then." They went. Why? The ride south took 3 days, stopping at inns along the post road. By the second day, Samuel had discovered that Nathaniel knew how to play chess, and had appointed himself Nathaniel's student with the authoritative manner of someone who had just identified a useful resource. They played on a small traveling board Nathaniel produced from his saddlebag balanced on Samuel's knee in the coach, Nathaniel explaining moves with patient precision, and Samuel absorbing them with a speed that made Nathaniel glance at Abigail with an expression that was complicated and quiet and entirely private. She looked back out of the window. Clara sat beside Abigail and said very little, but she watched Nathaniel teach her brother. And once, when Nathaniel corrected a move Samuel was about to make gently, without embarrassment, Clara said in a voice too low for Samuel to hear, "He's kind." Abigail looked at her daughter. "Yes," she said. "He is." "Is that why you liked him?" She thought about 18 months of careful letters about a man who wrote an entire page about why women ought to manage their own estates, about the specific quality of being known by someone who paid close enough attention. "That's part of it," she said. Clara nodded and went back to watching. On the evening of the second day, they stopped at a posting inn outside of Fredericksburg, the same town where Abigail had stood in the dust 5 years ago, and a pastor had told her the Lord kept better records than men did. She recognized the road, but did not say so. Some things did not need to be shared yet. After supper, after the children were settled, Nathaniel found her sitting on the bench outside the inn in the warm evening, the letters in her lap, the forged reply on top. He sat beside her. "Not too close. Careful still." "We'll reach Hargrove County tomorrow afternoon," he said. "I know." She kept her eyes on the letter. "I'd like to go to the lawyer first, before my mother knows we're in the county." "Agreed." "And I'd like the children kept at Mercer Hall until after the court appearance. They don't need to be in that house." "Also agreed." He paused. "Abigail, there's something I haven't told you yet, about your mother's petition." She went still. "She's filed it jointly," he said, "with your cousin, Edmund Whitmore. He's claiming that as the eldest male relative, he has standing to oversee the twins' upbringing in your mother's household. Edmund Whitmore." She had not thought about Edmund in 5 years. She had actively worked not to think about him. He was 4 years older than her, had always been her mother's favorite of the extended family, and had the particular slipperiness of a man who was never quite in the room when something bad happened, but was always first to benefit from it. "Of course she brought Edmund," Abigail said. "He has a lawyer. A good one, apparently. Of course he does." She set the letters aside. "How much of your influence can you bring to the magistrate hearing?" "Some," Nathaniel said honestly. I'm not going to lie to you about it. The Mercer name carries weight in Hargrove County, and that will help. But Margaret's going to argue that I have my own interest in the children, and she's not wrong, and the magistrate will know it. The evidence has to be what wins this, not my name. She nodded. The evidence will win it. You sound certain. I am certain, she said, because I have her handwriting on a forged letter, and your original letter beside it showing the difference, and a former Whitmore housemaid who wrote me 6 months ago to say that she left my mother's employ because she was asked to lie under oath about something she would not lie about. She turned to look at him. I found her through Pierce the headmaster, who gave me my letter of character. She's been in Pennsylvania 2 years. She'll testify. Nathaniel stared at her. You've been building this case. I have been building this case for 2 years, Abigail said. Since the moment I received a letter from an old Whitmore servant saying my mother was telling people in Hargrove County that I had abandoned my illegitimate children to the Mercer household. Since I understood that she was not going to leave us alone, and that the only way to protect Samuel and Clara was to be ready. He was quiet for a long moment. You did all of this, he said. Alone. Yes. From Mill Haven. Yes. While teaching school and raising 2 5-year-olds. They were 4 for most of it. He looked at her with an expression that she recognized distantly as the look on his face in the letters, the ones where he'd written about the navigation routes and the women's estates, the look of a man who found intelligence genuinely and helplessly compelling. She looked back at the road. Don't, she said quietly. Don't what? Don't look at me like that when we still have a courtroom to survive. A pause. Fair enough, he said. They reached the outskirts of Hargrove County the following afternoon, and the feeling of the familiar road under the wheels changed. Something in Abigail's chest tightened it, the way a fist tightens around something it does not want to let go of and does not want to keep. She had not been back in 5 years. The county looked the same. The fields were the same. The road bends were the same. The particular quality of Virginia summer light on red clay was the same. She had dreamed about this road sometimes, in the way you dream about things you've made yourself stop thinking about, suddenly vividly, and then not at all. Samuel pressed his face against the coach window. Is this where you're from, Mama? Yes. It's different from Mill Haven. It is. Do you like it? She looked out the window at the familiar road. I used to, she said. I'm going to decide whether I do again. Samuel accepted this and went back to studying the passing countryside with the geographical interest of a child who was already thinking about maps. Clara said nothing, but she reached over and put her hand on Abigail's knee just for a moment and then took it away. The lawyer's name was Josiah Fenn, and he was in his 60s, with white side whiskers and the methodical precision of a man who had spent 40 years believing that the truth properly documented and correctly presented would eventually defeat almost anything. He received them in his office at 4:30, looked at the letters Abigail spread before him, read the forged reply. Twice, held it up to the light from the window, set it down, looked at Abigail and said, How long have you had these to? 5 years, sir. And you kept them? I kept everything. He looked at Nathaniel. And the deceased Mrs. Mercer's testimony you mentioned a letter with her Richmond lawyer. I've sent for it, Nathaniel said. It should reach Hargrove County by Monday. Fenn tapped the forged letter with one finger. Margaret Whitmore is a formidable woman, he said. I will not pretend otherwise. She has allies on the county court. She has been cultivating them, I suspect, for some time. I know, Abigail said. Can we beat her? Fenn looked at the evidence. He looked at Abigail. He looked at Nathaniel. He said, I have practiced law in this county for 40 years, Miss Whitmore. I have never had a forgery case with this quality of original documentation. If the housemaid's testimony holds, and if the deceased's letter confirms the account, he stopped. We can beat her. Abigail breathed. There is one complication, Fenn said. She looked at him. Margaret Whitmore knows you're in the county, he said. My clerk saw her rider on the road this afternoon. She'll know by nightfall. He looked at the letters on the desk. I would strongly recommend that these documents stay here in this office under lock tonight. Abigail did not hesitate. "Take them." She slid every letter across the desk. 5 years of evidence. The loaded weapon she had carried since Virginia. She watched Josiah Fenn gather them carefully and set them in a lockbox, and she felt not lighter exactly, but differently weighted, as though the thing she had been carrying had shifted from her shoulders to a place where it could do its proper work. "There is one other thing," Nathaniel said. Both Fenn and Abigail looked at him. His expression had changed. Something had come into it that hadn't been there before, a careful, braced quality, the look of a man about to say something he knows will be difficult. "Margaret Whitmore's rider," he said. "He wasn't just on the road. He stopped at the posting inn where we stayed 2 nights ago. I saw him at supper. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to frighten the children." The room was very quiet. "She's known our route," Abigail said. "Since Fredericksburg," Nathaniel said. "At least." Abigail looked at the lockbox where her letters now sat. "She'll move tonight," she said. "Before the hearing. She'll try to—" She stopped. Thought. "The housemaid, my witness in Pennsylvania. If Margaret finds out who she is—" "I sent a second rider to Pennsylvania yesterday," Nathaniel said. "Before I told you about Edmund, I sent him with enough money to bring her here quickly and quietly, and instructions to come directly to Fenn's office." Abigail stared at him. "I told you," he said. "I've been building toward this too. For 2 years, Abigail. Different direction, same destination." She looked at him in the lamplight of Josiah Fenn's office. This man she had loved at 22, and lost at 24, and found again at 29. This man who had spent 2 years moving pieces she didn't know about toward a courtroom they both needed to walk out of with her children safe. And she thought with the quiet, controlled clarity that had kept her alive for 5 years. Not yet. Not until the courtroom is behind them. Not until the children are safe. But she thought it. Fenn cleared his throat. "I suggest," he said, "that you all get some rest. It is going to be a very long week." He was not wrong. What none of them knew yet was that Margaret Whitmore was not waiting for the hearing. She was already at Mercer Hall. She had been there for an hour. And she had not come alone. Mercer Hall had been Nathaniel's grandmother's house before it was his, and it carried the particular weight of a place that had absorbed too much history to ever feel entirely neutral. The housekeeper, Mrs. Dodd, met them at the door with the expression of a woman who had spent the last hour managing a situation she deeply resented. "Mr. Mercer," she said, and her eyes moved to Abigail and the children with a flicker of recognition that was not quite surprise. "Mrs. Whitmore arrived approximately an hour ago. She indicated she had been invited." Nathaniel's voice was very flat. "She was not." "I suspected as much, sir. She is in the front parlor. She brought Mr. Edmund Whitmore and a gentleman I do not know." Abigail did not look at Nathaniel. She was already doing arithmetic. Margaret had tracked their route from Fredericksburg, had arrived ahead of them, had positioned herself in Nathaniel's own house before they could establish ground. It was exactly the kind of move her mother made. Get inside the walls first. Make yourself the resident and everyone else the visitor. "The children," Abigail said quietly. "Mrs. Dodd is there, a room upstairs, where they can be settled, away from the front of the house." Mrs. Dodd looked at Samuel and Clara with the assessing warmth of a woman who knew children and liked them. "Of course, ma'am. Come along, little ones." Samuel looked at Abigail. He had gone quiet on the road from Fenn's office, sensing the shift in the air around the adults, the way children always sensed it, not knowing the specifics, but knowing the weight of it. "Mama." "Go with Mrs. Dodd," Abigail said. "I need you to stay upstairs with your sister. Can you do that?" "For how long? Until I come for you." He studied her face. "Is the bad thing happening now?" "Some of it," she said honestly. "I'm going to handle it. That's my job." He nodded once, the particular nod he had, the one that said he didn't like it, but he trusted her and took Clara's hand and followed Mrs. Dodd up the stairs without another word. Clara looked back once at Nathaniel and then at her mother, and her expression was so precisely calibrated between trust and worry that Abigail had to breathe through it before she could turn toward the parlor door. Nathaniel said quietly, "Together. Together. she said. He opened the door. Margaret Whitmore sat in the best chair in the room. Of course she did. She would have assessed the furniture the moment she walked in, and chosen accordingly with her hands folded in her lap, and her expression arranged into the particular configuration Abigail had spent her childhood trying to read. Not quite warm, not quite cold. The face of a woman who had already decided how the conversation would go and was simply waiting for the other participants to take their positions. Edmund stood to her left. He was 40 thick in the chest now, with the careful grooming of a man who understood that his primary asset was the impression he made in rooms. He looked at Abigail with an expression that managed to be simultaneously pitying and proprietary, which was a combination she found uniquely revolting. The third man was a stranger, 40s sharp-faced with the particular alertness of a lawyer who billed by the hour and wanted the meter running. He had a document case on the table in front of him. Margaret looked at Abigail for a long moment, and then she said, "My dear girl, you look tired." It was a masterstroke of an opening. 5 words that implied Abigail was fragile, that 5 years of independent living had cost her that she needed care she wasn't getting. Abigail had been raised by this woman. She knew every tool in the box. "I'm well, Mother," she said. "Thank you for your concern." "We've been worried," Margaret said. 5 years, Abigail. 5 years of silence. Do you have any idea? You filed a legal petition, Abigail said. 12 days ago. That is not the behavior of a worried mother. That is the behavior of someone executing a plan. A brief pause. Something shifted behind Margaret's eyes. Recalibration, Abigail thought. She had expected tears, or excuses, or the long-suffering daughter returning ashamed. She had not expected this. Edmund cleared his throat. "Abigail, we understand you've been through a great deal." "Edmund," Nathaniel said, and his voice carried the particular quietness of a man who has been patient for a long time and is no longer going to be. "You are in my house, without an invitation. I am going to ask you to let the women speak." Edmund looked at Nathaniel with the reflexive resentment of a man accustomed to being the largest presence in a room. But Nathaniel Mercer had built a shipping business from 23 years old, and had sat across tables from harder men than Edmund Whitmore, and he did not look away, and Edmund subsided. The unknown lawyer opened his document case. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "I am Cornelius Ashe, representing the Whitmore family in the matter of the custody petition regarding the minors, Samuel and Clara." "I know who you're representing," Abigail said. "Put the documents away, Mr. Ashe. This conversation is not the hearing." Ashe looked at Margaret. Margaret gave a slight nod. He closed the case. "Then what is this conversation?" Margaret said. Her voice had shifted, still controlled, but the warmth was gone. This was the voice Abigail had heard in the study, in the library, in every room in the Whitmore house where a door had been closed and the performance had come off. "This is me telling you," Abigail said, "before a magistrate tells you what the hearing is going to look like, so that you have the opportunity to withdraw the petition before it becomes public record." Silence. Margaret looked at her daughter with an expression that Abigail had never seen on her mother's face before, and therefore could not immediately name. It took her a moment to identify it. It was surprise. Genuine, unmanaged surprise. Margaret had not expected this offer. She had expected a daughter who came home frightened and bargained from weakness. "I have the letters," Abigail said. "All of them. Nathaniel's original courtship correspondence and your reply written in my name declining him. I have had them for 5 years. I took them the night before I left Virginia." The color left Margaret's face. It happened fast, a draining like water from a pitcher, and Abigail watched it happen and felt nothing she had not already made peace with. "I also have a former Whitmore housemaid who is prepared to testify about your practice of controlling correspondence within the household, and I have—" she paused. "I have Caroline's letter." Edmund made a sound. Margaret said nothing, but her hands still folded in her lap tightened. "Caroline left a letter with her Richmond lawyer," Abigail said, "detailing what you told her before the wedding, detailing the arrangement you made and the lies you told to hold it together." She kept her voice even. "She planned ahead. She was smarter than you gave her credit for." You don't have that letter, Margaret said. Her voice was different now, stripped of the performance. Her lawyer is in Richmond. You've been in Pennsylvania. Nathaniel sent for it 2 days ago, Abigail said. It will reach Hargrove County by Monday. The hearing is Wednesday. The room was very quiet. Edmund looked at Margaret. Margaret looked at Abigail. The lawyer Ash looked at his document case with the expression of a professional reassessing his position. Withdraw the petition, Abigail said. Today. Before this goes to record and becomes the story Hargrove County tells about this family for the next 20 years. Margaret Whitmore did not withdraw. Abigail had known she wouldn't. Had known it even as she made the offer because she knew her mother and Margaret Whitmore had never in her life walked away from a position she had publicly taken. To withdraw was to admit she could be beaten, and that admission was more intolerable to her than losing. But she needed Margaret to hear the offer. She needed it on record in Nathaniel's presence and Edmund's presence and the lawyer's presence that she had given her mother the chance. What came next was Margaret's choice. The children, Margaret said, are Whitmore blood. Whatever arrangement exists between you and Nathaniel Mercer, Samuel and Clara carry my family's name and my family's They carry my name, Abigail said. I am their mother. I have been their only parent for 5 years. They do not know your name. They have never been in your care. You have no claim on them that a forged letter and a lawyer can build, and the moment Josiah Fenn lays my evidence before the magistrate, every claim you have filed will collapse. Fenn! Edmund said it like a curse. You went to Fenn. First thing this afternoon. Edmund looked at Margaret again, and this time the look said something, a warning, or a signal, or a piece of information being passed between two people who had made plans Abigail didn't yet know the shape of. She filed that look away. This is not finished, Margaret said quietly. No. Abigail agreed. It's not. But I know how it ends. She turned toward the door. Nathaniel was already opening it. Abigail. Her mother's voice stopped her. Not the performance voice. The stripped voice. The one underneath all the tools and the architecture. You have no idea what I sacrificed to give this family what it has. Abigail turned back. She looked at her mother. Really looked at her, the way she had not permitted herself to look in 5 years. And she said, I know exactly what you sacrificed. You sacrificed me. She held her mother's gaze. It didn't have to be that way. That's the part I'll never forgive. She walked out. Nathaniel found her in the upstairs hallway 10 minutes later, standing outside the door, where she could hear Samuel and Mrs. Dodd engaged in what appeared to be a vigorous discussion about whether horses or dogs were more useful. She was leaning against the wall with her arms crossed and her eyes closed, and her breathing steady, in the disciplined way it got when she was managing something too large for the room. They're leaving, he said. All 3 of them. Ash looked like a man reconsidering his retainer. He won't reconsider it, she said. Edmund will pay whatever it takes to keep him. Edmund has wanted a piece of the Whitmore estate since before my father was in the ground. Abigail. He stopped beside her, close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him. The look that passed between Edmund and your mother before you left. I saw it too. She opened her eyes. I know. There's something we don't know yet. Yes. What are you thinking? She was quiet for a moment. My father's will left me a parcel of land, the Creek property. My mother contested it, but never succeeded because I had the original deed. She paused. I have been assuming she filed the custody petition to control Samuel and Clara as leverage over me, to force me to come back quietly and give up the land in exchange for leaving them alone. And now I think the land may not be what she wants. She looked at him. Edmund filed jointly with her. Edmund has no interest in raising 2 young children. He has no paternal instincts and no use for the complication. The only reason Edmund Whitmore does anything is money. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. She watched him think it through. The Whitmore account, he said. Your father's estate. If you were declared morally unfit and your children removed from your custody, the court might revisit the land deed, she said. Under the right legal argument that an unfit mother ought not to hold property, Edmund could file a secondary claim. My mother gets control of the children. Edmund gets the land. They split the prize. The hallway was very quiet. How much is the creek property worth? Nathaniel asked. My father thought it was worth about $400 when he left it to me, Abigail said. But that was 12 years ago. There's been a mill built 2 miles east since then. Water rights, Nathaniel said. If that creek feeds the mill race. It does, he said. I know that mill. I invested in it 4 years ago. He paused. Abigail, that creek property is worth closer to $4,000 now. She absorbed that. $4,000. Against which her mother and cousin had filed a custody petition, tracked her across 2 states, positioned themselves in Nathaniel's house, and built a legal case with a hired lawyer. All right, she said. All right. Then we need Fenn to know the full scope of what they're filing for. It's not just custody. It's the land. He needs to frame the hearing that way. I'll ride to him tonight. Wait. She put a hand on his arm the first time she had touched him, without it being incidental, without it being the brush of a sleeve or a hand passed over a table. She felt him go very still. Let me write the letter. I need Fenn to understand the specific language we need. The custody case and the property claim have to be heard as connected, as 2 parts of one fraud. She dropped her hand. He said carefully, You're good at this. I was trained to manage a household, she said. My mother's mistake was that she trained me to see every room clearly and then put me in a room she thought she controlled. He almost smiled. Her mistake, he agreed. The door opened and Samuel came out with Mrs. Dodd at his shoulder, his face carrying the particular brightness of a child who has been well fed and permitted to ask questions about horses for 20 minutes without anyone telling him to stop. He looked at both of them, at the way they were standing at the careful distance and the carefulness of their faces, and said, with the devastating accuracy of a 5-year-old, Are you and Nathaniel fighting? No, Abigail said. You look like you're fighting. We're thinking through a problem, she said. It looks similar. Samuel considered this. Can I help? No. I'm good at problems. I know you are. Go back inside with Mrs. Dodd. He went, but he left the door slightly open, which was Samuel's version of a protest. Abigail pulled it closed. Nathaniel was looking at the closed door. He's something, he said. He is, she said. He's going to be... She stopped. She hadn't said it out loud before. He's going to be extraordinary. Both of them are. I know, Nathaniel said quietly. I could see it in one afternoon. She looked at him. He was looking at the door still, and his expression was the unguarded one, the one he showed when he forgot to manage it. And it was full of something she recognized because she had felt it herself the first time Samuel had corrected her arithmetic at age 4, and then looked up with those bright, serious eyes, utterly unaware that he had done anything remarkable. Pride. Simple, enormous, uncomplicated pride. She had to look away. The letter to Fenn was written by 9 o'clock. Nathaniel's fastest rider left with it before 10. Abigail sat at the writing desk in the room Mrs. Dodd had prepared for her and listened to the house settle into quiet around her. The children asleep. The staff moved to their quarters. Nathaniel's footsteps going past her door, and then away down the hall, giving her the privacy she hadn't asked for but clearly needed. She sat with the empty desk in front of her. The letters were at Fenn's office. The housemaid witness was on her way from Pennsylvania. Caroline's letter was coming from Richmond. Everything she had built over 5 years was moving toward Wednesday, like a river finding its level. And yet, she kept thinking about the look between Edmund and her mother, the look she had filed away. There was something she didn't know yet. She could feel the shape of it, the space where a piece of information should be, and the absence bothered her, the way a missing word in a sentence bothered her when she was editing student work. Something was wrong with the structure. Something didn't fit. She was still sitting there, still turning it over when she heard it. A sound below. Not the house settling. A door. She went to the hall, moving quietly, and looked over the landing rail. The front entrance below was ajar. She went downstairs in her stockinged feet, moving along the wall where the boards were less likely to creak, and she pushed the door open and looked out into the dark summer night. Nathaniel was standing on the front step. He was not alone. There was a man with him, a stranger, youngish, travel-worn, delivering something with the urgent posture of a man who had ridden hard and had news that could not wait until morning. Nathaniel took the object, a letter, and read it. She watched his face in the dim light from the hall, and she saw the moment it changed. Not a slow change, a fast one, the color going out of it the way it had gone out of her mother's face in the parlor, but different. This was not the loss of a position. This was something worse. He looked up and saw her standing in the doorway. "Abigail," he said. "What is it?" He came to her and held out the letter. She took it. She read the first line. It was from Josiah Fenn's clerk. "Mr. Mercer, Miss Whitmore, you must come to the office at first light. Mr. Fenn has been served with a counter-motion filed this evening by Mr. Cornelius Ashe. The motion requests that the hearing be moved to Richmond under the Richmond Circuit Court on the grounds that the Hargrove magistrate has a conflict of interest. The motion also includes a secondary claim we did not anticipate. You must read it in full. Come immediately at first light. Do not delay." She read it twice. Then she lowered the letter and looked at Nathaniel. "Richmond," she said. "They're trying to move it," he said, "away from Fenn, away from the local magistrate, into a court where my name carries less weight and your mother's Richmond connections carry more." "And the secondary claim," she said. "What is the secondary claim they didn't anticipate?" He was quiet for a moment. "They've filed a claim against the legitimacy of the twins," he said. "Not just custody. They're arguing that without a legal marriage between you and me, Samuel and Clara are—" He stopped. She said it for him. "Illegitimate. Under Virginia law, an illegitimate child can be made a ward of the court, which means the court decides where they go," she said. "Not me, not you." She stood in the doorway with the letter in her hand and the summer dark behind her and the sleeping house in front of her, and she felt it, the full weight of what her mother had built, the architecture of it, how far ahead it had been planned, how many moves it had been designed to survive. She breathed once, then she said, "Wake Nathaniel's lawyer." "I am Nathaniel's lawyer. His second lawyer," she said. "The Richmond one. The one who handles the shipping contracts." She turned to go back inside. "We need someone who knows that circuit court, tonight. We are not walking into Richmond on a secondary claim without knowing the ground." "Abigail, and tell Mrs. Dodd to have the children ready to travel at first light," she said, already moving up the stairs. "If they move this to Richmond, we move to Richmond. I am not leaving my children in Hargrove County 1 hour longer than I have to." She went back up the stairs, and she did not look back, and she did not let herself feel the fear until she was behind the closed door of her room, where she sat on the edge of the bed and pressed both hands over her face and breathed. Counted to 5. Breathed out, counted to 5. Breathed in the way she had learned to do in a January snowstorm when she was 24 years old, and more alone than she had ever been. Then she stood up. She sat at the desk and picked up her pen. She began to write. She wrote until 2 in the morning. Not letters this time. Not evidence. She wrote everything she knew about Margaret Whitmore, every pattern, every method, every move her mother had made in 40 years of managing people like pieces on a board. She wrote it the way she taught her students to write a contract argument. Facts first, inference, second conclusion, third. No emotion, no appeal. Just the shape of the thing laid bare. When she finished, she had 6 pages. She read them back once, and what she saw was not a portrait of a villainous woman. It was something more precise and more damning than that. It was the portrait of a woman who had decided at some point long before Abigail was born that love was a liability and control was the only reliable currency. Everything Margaret had ever done, every letter intercepted, every daughter managed, every alliance built and traded, followed from that one foundational belief, with the terrible logic of a person who had never once questioned her own premise. Abigail set the pages down. She thought about Caroline, 19 years old, at an altar in white silk, marrying a man she had been told wanted her built on a foundation of her mother's architecture. She thought about what it cost to be the daughter Margaret Whitmore preferred: the compliance, the beautiful obedience, the gradual erasure of any self that did not serve the family's position. She thought about Caroline's letter sitting in a Richmond lawyer's office, planned ahead, left behind, like an act of posthumous courage, by a woman who had finally, at the end, refused to let the lie stand. She thought about Samuel and Clara, asleep down the hall, 5 years old, and entirely unaware that they were the center of a legal storm their grandmother had been building for 2 years. She folded the 6 pages and put them in her traveling bag. Then she lay down on the bed without undressing and closed her eyes and slept for 4 hours because she needed her mind clear, and she had learned long ago that grief and fear and the full weight of what was coming could all be managed better from the other side of sleep. Koi. First light came gray and warm. She was already dressed when Mrs. Dodd knocked. The children were moved to the kitchen for breakfast, Samuel eating with one hand and attempting to draw a map of Virginia from memory with the other. Clara eating with the focused efficiency of a person who understood that food was fuel, and they were going somewhere. Nathaniel was in the front hall with his riding coat on and the expression of a man who had also not slept much, but was not going to mention it. His Richmond lawyer, a man named Harwell, younger than Fenn, faster talking with the contained energy of someone who lived on difficult cases, had arrived at 6 and was already in conversation with Nathaniel when Abigail came down the stairs with her bag. Harwell looked at her and said without preamble, "You're the mother." "I am." "Fenn says you have a forged letter and a housemaid witness." "And the deceased wife's testimony," she said. "Coming from Richmond." He nodded fast. "The legitimacy claim is their strongest move. In the Richmond circuit, under Judge Alderman, an unmarried mother with 5-year-old children and no documented paternity has an uphill argument." He paused. "Unless paternity is established before we walk in." She looked at Nathaniel. Nathaniel said, "I'll acknowledge paternity formally, before the hearing, in writing before a Hargrove witness." Harwell nodded. "That changes the ground. A father who acknowledges the children, and a mother with documented proof of deliberate interference. That's not an uphill argument anymore. That's a case." He looked between them. "The motion to move to Richmond Fen is contesting it this morning. The Hargrove magistrate has 48 hours to rule on jurisdiction. If we keep it in Hargrove, we're on our ground. If it moves, we go to Richmond," Abigail said. Harwell looked at her. "You sound certain." "I am certain," she said. "Wherever this hearing is, we walk into it with more evidence than they can answer, and a clearer story than they can tell. The geography doesn't change that." Harwell studied her for a moment, with the assessing eyes of a man who spent his life measuring how well witnesses held up. Then he said, "All right, let's go see Fenn." Here. The next 48 hours moved in the compressed, relentless rhythm of a thing that has been set in motion and will not stop for sentiment. The Hargrove magistrate ruled on jurisdiction by noon of the first day the hearing would remain in Hargrove County. It was a small victory, but a real one, a crack in the wall Margaret and Edmund had tried to build overnight. Caroline's letter arrived from Richmond at 4 in the afternoon. Fenn read it first, then Harwell, then Nathaniel, then Abigail, last alone in Fenn's office with the door closed while the others waited in the hall. It was 3 pages in Caroline's careful, slightly unpracticed hand. She had never been as naturally fluent a writer as Abigail had always preferred speaking to writing, and it began. "If this is being read, then what I was afraid of has happened, and my mother has not let it rest. So I will not let it rest either." She wrote about the week before the wedding, about Margaret coming to her with a story about Abigail and a man in Richmond, about the letter Margaret had shown her supposedly in Abigail's hand, declining Nathaniel's courtship, about the way Margaret had framed it not as a manipulation, but as a gift. "Abigail has made her choice, and now you can make yours." Caroline wrote, "I was 19, and I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that what I was being given was real and not taken from someone else. I knew somewhere I knew, but I did not look at it directly. That is my sin in this, and I own it." She wrote about the marriage, about the years, about the growing understanding that something was wrong with the foundation without knowing its exact shape until much later. She wrote, "Nathaniel was kind to me. He was always kind. But there are two kinds of kindness, the kind a man gives because he loves you, and the kind a man gives because he is a good person and you are in front of him. I had the second kind. I always knew it. I did not know why until he told me about Abigail 2 months before I died. The last paragraph, I am leaving this letter so that my mother cannot finish what she started. Abigail did not leave because she was weak or immoral or unfit. She left because she was the only one of us who saw clearly what was being done and had the courage to refuse it. If there are children, and I believe there are, they belong with her. They have always belonged with her. I am sorry I could not say this sooner. I am saying it now." Abigail sat with the letter in her hands for a long time. She did not cry. She had done her crying in a schoolhouse in Pennsylvania years ago for the version of this she had imagined and never received. What she felt now was something quieter and more permanent than grief. Something that might, given enough time, become close to peace. She folded the letter carefully. She opened the door. "We're ready," she said. The hearing was Wednesday morning. The Hargrove County Courthouse was a plain brick building on the main road, and by 8 in the morning, there were more people outside it than any ordinary Wednesday warranted. Word had traveled, it always traveled in a county this size, and while nobody had the full story, enough pieces were in circulation that half of Hargrove had formed an opinion, and the other half had come to form one. Abigail arrived with Nathaniel Fenn and Harwell. She wore her best dress, not her finest. She didn't own her finest anymore, but a dark blue wool that was clean and well pressed, and said, "I take this seriously without saying, I am trying to impress you." Her hair was pinned simply. Her hands were at her sides. Margaret and Edmund arrived 5 minutes later with Cornelius Ashe and 2 other men Abigail didn't recognize. Margaret was in black, which Abigail noted and filed away black for mourning, or black for authority, or black because Margaret Whitmore understood costuming as well as any actress, and had chosen the color that made her look like someone who had suffered. They did not look at each other. The magistrate was a man named Horace Beaumont, 60 spare, with the economy of movement and expression of a man who had presided over too many hearings to waste energy on performance. He was not known to be a warm man, but he was known to be a fair one, and Fenn had told Abigail that fairness was all they needed. The hearing began. Ashe opened for Margaret and Edmund. He was good. Abigail had expected him to be good, and he framed the case with the smoothness of long practice. A mother who had abandoned her children. Children born outside of marriage. A concerned grandmother seeking to provide stability. A family trying to protect 2 innocent minors from the consequences of their mother's choices. She sat very still and listened to it and let it wash over her without touching anything essential. Then Fenn stood up. Josiah Fenn was 63 years old and had been practicing law in Hargrove County since before half the people in the room were born, and he had the particular authority of a person whose competence was so established that he no longer needed to perform it. He simply opened the evidence, laid it before the magistrate, and began to explain what it meant. The forged letter first. He set the original courtship letters, Nathaniel's address to Abigail, intercepted before they ever reached her beside the forged reply. He explained the handwriting, the paper stock, the particular formation of certain letters that showed Margaret's hand rather than Abigail's. He called Nathaniel to speak to the authenticity of his own letters and to confirm that the reply he had received, which he had believed was from Abigail, had changed the course of his decisions entirely. Nathaniel spoke for 11 minutes. He was precise and unadorned, and did not look at Margaret while he spoke, which was its own kind of statement. Then Fenn called the housemaid. Her name was Ruth Hadley, and she was in her 40s, broad-shouldered and plain-spoken, and she had worked in the Whitmore household for 8 years before she left. She described in simple direct language a household where all correspondence was managed by Margaret Whitmore incoming and outgoing, and where she had twice been asked to carry letters she later understood had been altered. She described Margaret instructing her on what to say to certain callers. She described the specific morning 5 years ago when she had seen Margaret seal and send a letter she had not written. Ashe cross-examined her hard. Ruth Hadley did not waver. She had left the Whitmore household, she said, because she was asked to lie about something she would not lie about. She said it without drama, looking at the magistrate and not at the opposing table. And the simplicity of it landed in the room with more weight than anything theatrical could have managed. Then Fenn read Caroline's letter. He read all 3 pages in full, in his steady, unhurried voice, and the room was absolutely silent while he read. Abigail watched the magistrate's face and saw the moment 3/4 of the way through when Beaumont set down his pen and simply listened. She watched Edmund's jaw tighten. She watched Cornelius Ashe write something on his paper and then stop writing. She did not watch her mother. When Fenn finished, he set the letter down. Ashe stood up to object to the admissibility of a deceased woman's written account. Harwell countered with 3 precedents from Virginia Circuit Court. Beaumont listened to both arguments and then said, with the brevity of a man who had already made up his mind, "I'll admit it. Continue." Edmund leaned to Ashe and said something low and urgent. Ashe shook his head. Then something happened that Abigail had not planned and had not anticipated. Samuel walked in. He had been left with Mrs. Dodd at a boarding house 2 streets away, under firm instructions to stay. He had clearly walked out the door the moment her back was turned. Crossed 2 streets, found the courthouse by asking a man on the road, opened the door himself and walked in. He was 5 years old. He was wearing his good shirt. His dark hair was falling across his forehead exactly the way his father's did. He walked directly to Abigail's side, which meant he walked directly past the magistrate's bench, and Magistrate Beaumont looked down at him with an expression that managed to be simultaneously stern and involuntarily charmed. "Young man," Beaumont said, "this is a formal proceeding." "Yes, sir," Samuel said. "I know. I came because it's about us." Silence. Beaumont looked at Abigail. Abigail looked at Samuel with the expression of a mother calculating whether to remove him and decided in half a second that removing him would do more damage than what was happening right now. "Samuel," she said, "you were supposed to stay." "I know," he said, "but it's about me and Clara. I ought to be here." Beaumont looked at the boy for a long moment. Then he looked at Ashe, then at Fenn, then back at the boy. "What's your name?" Beaumont asked. Samuel Mercer." He said the last name without hesitation, and Abigail understood in that instant that Samuel had been listening to the adult conversations more carefully than any of them had realized, and had made a decision about his own name sometime in the last 3 days without telling anyone. Something moved in Nathaniel's face that he did not try to hide. "And who is your father, Samuel?" Beaumont asked. Samuel pointed at Nathaniel. "He is," he said. "He stayed. He came to find us, and he taught me chess, and he never treated me like a secret." He paused with the gravity of a 5-year-old delivering a considered verdict. "A father is someone who stays. That's what Mama always says." The room was very quiet. Then Clara came in. She was 30 seconds behind her brother, walking with the composed deliberateness of a child who has thought about her entrance, and she came to stand beside Samuel, and looked at the magistrate with her steady measuring eyes, and said, "Sir, I'm Clara. I'm his sister. We're both here now." Beaumont looked at both children for a long moment. Then he looked at Margaret Whitmore. Margaret was sitting very still. Her hands were folded in her lap. Her face was composed always the performance, but something in her eyes was different. Something Abigail had never seen there before. She looked for the first time in Abigail's memory like someone who had lost, not the hearing. Not yet Beaumont hadn't ruled, but something older and more fundamental. She looked like a woman who had spent 40 years building a particular kind of world and was sitting in the middle of it, watching it fail to hold and understanding at last that the failure was not external. Beaumont asked the children to sit with their mother. Abigail settled them on either side of her Samuel, immediately attempting to understand the procedural mechanics of what was happening. Clara leaning slightly against Abigail's arm, with the quiet warmth of a child who has decided the grown-ups are handling it, and she can afford to rest. Ashe made his closing argument. It was shorter than his opening. The energy had gone out of it. Fenn made his. Then Beaumont called a recess of 20 minutes. He came back in 18. He settled himself, arranged his papers, and looked at the room with the expression of a man who has reached a conclusion and is going to deliver it without decoration. The custody petition filed by Margaret Whitmore and Edmund Whitmore, he said, is denied. Ash was already on his feet. Your Honor, the secondary claim regarding legitimacy is also denied, Beaumont said without looking up. Mr. Mercer has filed a formal acknowledgement of paternity witnessed this morning. The children are acknowledged by their father and have been in the continuous care and custody of their mother for 5 years. The claim of abandonment is directly contradicted by the documented evidence before this court. He paused. Furthermore, the evidence of deliberate interference with correspondence demonstrated through the forged letter and corroborated by 2 independent witnesses constitutes the kind of fraud this court is not prepared to reward with the outcome it was designed to produce. He looked up. The petition is denied in full. The children remain with their mother. The property deed filed under Miss Abigail Whitmore's name is confirmed and stands. He looked at Ash. Tell your clients, Mr. Ash, that any future filing of this nature will be reviewed with the understanding that this court has seen the full record. Is that understood? Ash said tightly. Yes, Your Honor. Beaumont banged his gavel once. It was done. Chan. Abigail sat very still for a moment after the room began to move around her. Samuel said, Did we win? Yes, she said. He made a sound of fierce satisfaction and looked at Nathaniel, who was crouched down to his level, now both of them looking at each other with the slightly overwhelmed expressions of people who have just realized something large is permanently true. Clara put her hand in Abigail's. Abigail held it. She looked across the room at her mother. Margaret was standing assisted by Edmund, her composure intact but diminished the way a structure is intact after a flood but is no longer what it was. She did not look at Abigail. She allowed Edmund to steer her toward the door, and she moved with the careful dignity of a woman who has decided that how she leaves a room is the last thing she can control. At the door she stopped. She turned. She looked at Abigail across the emptying room. A long look, the longest her mother had ever given her, the one without any tools in it, and then she walked out. Abigail watched her go and felt where she had expected to feel triumph, something quieter and more complicated. Not forgiveness. Not yet, possibly, not ever. But the particular freedom that comes when you stop waiting for a person to understand what they did to you, when you accept that the understanding will never come, and you choose to be free anyway. Josiah Fenn appeared at her elbow. Miss Whitmore, he said, I should like to say that in 40 years of practice, I have rarely seen evidence this carefully preserved and presented. He paused. Your father would have been proud of you. She looked at the old lawyer. Thank you, Mr. Fenn, she said, for everything. He nodded once with the economy of a man who means what he says and doesn't require a longer form to say it, and walked away. Nathaniel came to stand beside her. They stood for a moment in the emptying courthouse, Samuel chattering at the air in front of him about the proceedings, Clara still holding Abigail's hand with her quiet, steady grip. The apology, Nathaniel said quietly, the one you asked me to wait until after the courtroom. She looked at him. I'm sorry, he said, for every day of those 5 years, for not looking harder at that letter, for not knowing you well enough at 23 to know you would never have written those words. He paused. I'm sorry it took so long to find you. She looked at him for a long moment. This man who had come up the Millhaven Road on a gray horse with 5 years of looking in his face, and she said, I receive it. He breathed out. I'm not the girl you wrote those letters to, she said. I want you to know that. She was 22, and she believed that honesty between two people was protection enough against the world. I am not that person anymore. I know, he said. What I am now is harder, more careful. I don't trust easily, and I don't give ground easily, and I will never again let someone else manage my correspondence. She looked at him steadily. But I am also more certain of what I want than I have ever been in my life. And I know the difference between a man who stayed and a man who was worth staying for. He was very still. So, she said, if you are asking me, and I believe you have been asking me in the way you have carefully and without pressure since you rode up that road in Millhaven, then yes, the answer is yes. But it will be slow, and it will be honest, and there will be no pretending that the 5 years didn't happen. I don't want to pretend anything, he said. I just want to be in the room. You're in the room, she said. Samuel, who had been listening with the total attention of a child who pretends not to listen, looked up and said, Does that mean we're going back to Millhaven? Abigail looked at him. We're going back to Millhaven, she said. We have a school to run. And Nathaniel? She looked at Nathaniel. He's coming too, she said. Good. They went back. Not immediately. There were papers to file a property deed to confirm a housemaid witness to see safely home and a school in Millhaven that had been without its teacher for 2 weeks and was not going to forgive that without a thorough explanation and a very good first week back. But they went back. Nathaniel came. He funded the school's expansion, new books, a second teacher, a small scholarship fund for children who couldn't afford the fees. He did not do it with the flourish of a man performing generosity. He did it the way he did everything that mattered, quietly, practically, because it needed doing, and he had the means. He learned slowly to be in a house with 2 children who were different from each other, and both completely unlike anyone he had ever spent sustained time around. Samuel taught him things usually unwanted, always accurate about chess geography and the behavior of river fish. Clara, over the course of many months, began occasionally to speak to him in the direct, unguarded way she spoke to people she had decided to trust. And he understood that this was a gift she gave sparingly, and he received it accordingly. Abigail watched all of it. She was good at watching. She had always been good at watching. What she watched over the months that followed was a man learning to stay, not performing staying, not making a production of it, just being present day after day for the slow, ordinary accumulation of a shared life. The disagreements and the meals and the difficult evenings and the small victories, and the way Samuel announced one Thursday that Nathaniel had won their chess game for the first time, and this was according to Samuel, because Samuel had taught him well enough. One evening in the fall, she found him in the schoolhouse after hours sitting with Clara, who was teaching him to write her name in the careful block letters she had learned. He was concentrating with the earnest effort of a man who understood that this was important and was not going to do it wrong. Abigail stood in the doorway and watched and did not announce herself for a long moment. Then Clara looked up and saw her, and smiled the full, unguarded smile that Clara gave rarely and meant entirely, and Abigail thought with the clear and certain knowledge of a woman who has built everything she has from the ground up and knows the difference between solid ground and beautiful appearance. This is real. This is the thing itself. She stepped inside. The school grew. The children grew. The story of what had happened in the Hargrove County Courthouse traveled the way stories travel, imperfectly, incompletely, but in the direction of truth, and what people remembered in the end was not the scandal, but the woman who had walked out of a church with nothing and come back with enough to win. Abigail Whitmore had been called ruined. She had called it a beginning, and everything she built after that, the school, the children, the slow and honest life she chose, with a man who learned to stay, proved that the women who survive the burning are always the ones who decide in the ash and the quiet what they are going to build next. She decided. She built. And it was more than enough.